Good afternoon. I am Afroz and it's my privilege to present before you Dr. Afroz Ashrafi, Professor of English, who will speak on the two selected stories of Premchand, respectively Kafan and Poos ki Raat. Also, he will go into what makes Premchand a writer of substance and universal appeal by deconstructing the ideological strands in the selected stories. Hope you'll find it worthy. Thank you.
Good afternoon, everybody. Thank you very much for having introduced me and brought me before the audience. As I had said, that today I will be talking about Premchand, since it is a Premchand Jayanti. I'm so sorry for this continued interruption. The weather conditions is also not good, so that might be also hindering a live telecast. So that's what the problem here is. You lose connectivity, hearing, and they keep coming back. Anyway, so this is something which breaks your rhythm. So what I was trying to say that I will be deconstructing the two stories of Premchand, the two deconstructed, two highly valued and much vaunted stories of Premchand. That is obviously they are Kafan and Poos ki Raat. About Premchand, quite a few words are very important as a kind of an understanding to his art, that Premchand is a part of our literary history, a very inalienable part of our literary history. That is to say that whenever we talk of Hindi and Urdu literature, or the literature of the subcontinent in general, we cannot afford to marginalize or sideline a writer like Premchand, given the dimensions of his art, given the wide variety of his art. But one thing which always ails me, which always arraigns me, which makes me myself question that whether really if Premchand can be viewed today in the context of the changing time, will he appear to be as much relevant as he was during his own as he was I'm sorry for as he was during his own period, as he was during his own period. So the important part is this. So I will stay focused on this literary Indian tradition where Premchand is very centrally located, where most of the literatures keep revolving around personality of Premchand. Even in 2020, we have celebrations, we have lamentations, we have all kinds of things about him. But then still, art is never permanent, remember, and art always calls for a re-evaluation, because if you more abide by the idea of this postmodern temper, which does not believe in the finality of judgment, so when there is no finality of judgment, then there is always a possibility that a writer can always be seen in a new context, because he remains indeterminate. His art remains indeterminate. There can be no determinacy about him, and we cannot say with any degree of confidence or any degree of authority that, well, this is the view, or this is the interpretation which is going to hold for all times to come. That we cannot say even about Shakespeare. That it cannot be said about any writer, that in terms of a permanence of approach, in terms of a permanence of interpretation, that this interpretation is going to hold waters for all times to come. That's never going to be, because we have writers, we have readers, and we have angles, we have points of view, we have points of view which are very different, which are very conflicting. So about Premchand, when he wrote, that was the time of the first part of the 20th century, and that was of pre-colonial India. That was a pre-colonial India, that is to say, pre-colonial India. And this pre-colonial India, you had a whole variety of problems. There was slavery, there was poverty, there was debt, there was this colonial excesses and everything was going about, and the society wasn't a very developed one. And since the society was not a developed one, Premchand generally wrote on what he perceived to be a society of the poor, what he perceived to be a society of the downtrodden, what he perceived to be a society of the classes which generally struggle. This feudal structure was also very much brought into play. Their excesses were gone into, looked into, examined, viewed and reviewed. So all these things were there. But then Premchand's time was the most, see what I'm trying to say, that Premchand's time was the most conducive period in the history of world literature for a transition, for a shift from because see, until 1920s there was more a tendency to write on the lofty idealism, to write on lofty idealism, to write on what was not what was very surreal, that was something very utopian, something that was being chased as an ideal which was never going to be a possibility of sorts. So there is a transition in Europe when you find that writers were discarding this lofty idealism and coming about with issues like the rights of the working class, like the restoration of human dignity to those who were disgraced by this elitism, and of course the other issues like there's a movement from a hero to anti-hero, and from anti-hero to the society itself taking over as the hero of the time. Today what we find in novels, what we find in fiction, that today individuals aren't the heroes. No individuals are heroes. Bildungsroman was there in 20th century. So that Bildungsroman where you had the rise of a protagonist, and the story was based on the rise and fall of a protagonist itself. But then there is a shift now. So in that shift, how Premchand comes about, where we locate Premchand as a writer whose understanding of the problems of his own time, whether they really hang around, whether they are the problems that really Premchand discussed, or there was something that Premchand did not bother to go into or to look into. That's what I think was basically a question, and a very important question to be raised here in the context of this Premchand's writings, that whether Premchand created a world, it was a microcosmic world, or was it a microcosmic world? So for me, I think Premchand created a very microcosmic world of people. It wasn't a microcosm, because what were the guiding principle, or what was a kind of a guidepost for Premchand was this didactic strain in his stories, this element of didacticism, which kept creeping into his art, which almost I think he did for a very long time some kind of moral policing, that what is good for the society, what is bad for the society, what are the values to hold on, what are the social and political ethos to be honored and respected and to be brought into the social fabric of the existence. So all Premchand had these ideas very much at the back of his mind, and all these were manifested eventually into his writing. So what I believe, my own doubt is that whether Premchand really had extended the canvas of his writings from didacticism, from moral policing, from theorizing, or from giving lessons in civility, or lessons in a decent social conduct. That was the demand of the time, and Premchand's period wasn't a very developed period in the sense that what we have today. So those conditions were very different, and under those conditions, Premchand might appear to be more relevant than today, because today things have changed completely. As for the realism, people say there are many critics who are very inclined to believe that Premchand was a realist to the core. So he wrote what he observed. So there is no gap between his observation and his eventual manifestation of things that were recorded on his own imagination. So that, I think, is a very far-fetched idea. That idea isn't very convincing in terms of a portrayal of the society, the way it really existed. So there were the other dimensions beyond poverty, beyond this class struggle. We do not find much of a much of a manifestation of this feudal and proletariat structure in Premchand's stories. So my focus is not that I'm going to talk about the whole gamut of Premchand stories. I will be largely focused on what Jack London did, or what James Hanley did, or what Joyce Carey did. So can you really have a comparison of Premchand with these writers, for example, we have a writer like Jack Jones, we have a writer of Joyce Carey, we have a writer like James Hanley. These are the people who really brought this realism into fiction, who effected a kind of a transition in the writing of fiction itself. Which primarily suggested that there is going to be a shift in focus. At that touch of idealism was completely discarded, was completely disowned. But then, as far as when we come back to Premchand, we find that we have an officer who is issuing a guidepost to the people of the society. So that's where my problems really start coming up. That the canvas of Premchand wasn't very wide. He wasn't very imaginative in the sense that he was writing for the people of his time, and his stories possibly they do not go much beyond the period in which Premchand lived. Premchand died in 1936, and that was the period when progressive movement was growing fast, as he himself was the president of the All India Progressive Writers Association, and he presided over the initial session of this progressive writers. So we got writers from the progressive literary movement. We got writers from them. We got the likes of Mantu from him, from this progressive association, progressive writers association. We got writers like Ghulam Abbas. We got writers like Rajinder Singh Bedi. So they were writers of a very different mold. Anyway, that's not my concern to go into every writer of that particular period beyond the time of Premchand. My focus will be on, as I said, Kafan and Poos ki Raat. Kafan, is a very is an important story, is a great tale, as it is generally and widely believed that Kafan is one of the finest stories written in the history of the mankind, or possibly one of the greatest. Even today, it stands out as the most wanted story of Premchand, as the most celebrated story of Premchand. But then it's not only that it is the most celebrated story of Premchand, at the same time, I suspect it is the most controversial story also of Premchand. Why it is most controversial? It has its own reasons to be controversial. And if we take this argument of Professor Bismillah of Jamia Millia Islamia, who says that this story was translated from Urdu into Hindi, and in the process of translation, there are many things that were lost. I don't know how far that is correct, and what is the actual story, and whether Premchand and what if Professor Bismillah also goes to the extent of saying that Kafan's end of Kafan is not what it was originally written by Premchand. So maybe we do not buy that. The authenticity of the theories we do not buy very conveniently. We have our own skeptical temper. We have our own doubts. But then, of course, in the West in the 1920s, both England and America were writing novels of very serious hues. And you have writers like Dos Pisas, you have writers like James T. Farrell, you have writers like James T. Farrell and John Steinbeck, who emerged with his grand epic, proletariat epic, Grapes of Wrath. So when you had writing novels like this, when there was the war ravaged America was trying to rebuild itself, and this 20th century England was reeling under the impact of industrialization, and of course there were some very stark and crepuscular and dingy images of those factory workers who were falling prey to the rising tendency of capitalism. All these are very manifested and captured with scintillating details by the writers of those very times. So here, in the context of Premchand and in the context of Kafan, which is a very big story. Obviously, it is a big story. It is a great story. It is a great narrative of a human tendency, that what are the responses of a human being, what are the responses, or what responses can be associated with the human being, even under duress or even in times of crisis. As you know, as the story goes, that there are three characters. There are three characters. One is Madho, then you have Gesu, and Abu Budya, who doesn't say anything. Obviously, she is suffering most. And remember how the story begins. The way this story goes. Kafan, both father and son are eating potatoes are being burnt, and then they are eating burning potatoes sitting outside the hut, and both Madhu and Gesu, the duo, and they are busy eating boiled potatoes, and there is wife of, there is a one lady called Budya, one woman called Budya, who is the wife of this Madho, who is grimacing in labor pain. That pain is very indifferent. Remember, that pain doesn't bother anyone. Neither Gesu is very concerned about that. Even nor Madho. Even Gesu sometimes cajoles him also to go and see and have a look at your wife there, who is writhing in pain, who is suffering, who is battling this labor pain. But then both are so busy eating potatoes. And possibly, remember, what happens here is that it's a very indifferent human response to a crisis. Question starts from here only, that whether you can be so indifferent, whether you can be so callous, or whether somebody can be really so phlegmatic that even he will not bother to have a look at his dying wife, who is struggling there, who is grimacing in pain inside the hut, and outside both father and son are busy eating potato, and father does not go to see because he says, well, she will be more in trouble to look to see me, and the son does not go because he believes that if he goes, then his father will also take his share of potatoes. This is a very this is something which is very unnerving, something which leaves you restless, something which leaves you really very concerned about a situation in which, if you happen to find yourself, what you would be your responses. The problem here is this, that can we really deem these responses as a normal human response? This is the first question. A question which is very important, that the response of Madhu, can it be seen in terms of a normal response of a human being in an abnormal situation, in a crisis situation? That's first question that we must address. Premchand doesn't say much about that. Premchand doesn't say much about that. He makes them, he leaves them eating our potatoes outside, and of course, meanwhile, what happens? Well, eventually dies out of this labor pain, and from there, a new drama begins. And what is that new drama? That now there is the question of the funeral of the dead woman. That also, a crisis gets converted into an opportunity for money making. It becomes a money making opportunity. So what happens here, that both Madhu and Gesu are not very perturbed, they are not befuddled, they do not cringe, they do not wail, they are not beating their chest for the loss of a woman who had at least brought some semblance of order to their house. But they have no sympathy for the dead woman. That is absolutely stunning. This is where this normal sense gets completely paralyzed. That can you really legitimize this kind of a reaction from a human being who loses his wife, and still he is not much bothered about that? This indifference itself, to the extent a man can be dehumanized. That's what the question is. That to the extent a man can be dehumanized, can he be dehumanized to this extent, where your responses will be phlegmatic, where your responses will go stoic, there you will be completely incapacitated. So these are some of the disturbing questions that Premchand does leave in Kafan, one of which is Madhu's own response, which is very dramatic, which is very bestial, which is very savage, which is not convincing at all under those trying situations. So what happens? Even after the death, those father and son do not bother much. They do not bother much. Why they do not bother much? Because they think that this is something which is not very unusual, something which is a very a normal kind of a situation for them to be in. Because remember, you must understand this background also at the same time, that both were very lousy, both were logy, they were lazy, they were not known to work, they were duffers of the highest order. And remember, this was their general reputation, both, that these two do not work. Why to toil out there in the field when you can get to eat without doing anything, when you have the food without doing anything, when the food is brought to you, is given by the people and all that, so there is no point in working. So that question of human conscience also comes into play here. Excuse me. So this is really very important to look into a dimension of a human mind. This is a piece of human mind. This is a piece of human response. And this piece is a very disturbing one. It is an intimidating one. It cannot be billed or dubbed as a normal response to a crisis. This is what the issue is here. A larger question is this, that how can you have people like Madhu or Gesu in a civilized society? Can you really have, or can you afford people like them? That is one part of it. Another, see, the second one, that now what happens? They also make money out of this. They go to Zamindar and they go and submit and surrender and they cry and all that. And this Zamindar gives them 2 rupees. They get it, and then the 2 rupees that they get from this from the Zamindar, that they are not very happy with that. This is the money for the burial of the dead. This is not the money for the burial of the dead. This is not the money for the burial of Budhya who is dead. Now what they say? Okay, they will start merry-making. Life becomes easier for them. Life becomes a more pleasurable activity for them. Life becomes a more pleasurable act for them. And what they do? They go to a pub, a local pub. They start dancing, drinking, eating this, and then some more money pours in. People give them money and all that. So what they have the best of the food, they have the best of the feast. They drink, they booze, they dance. Here, remember that can you have individuals, living individuals in flesh, that who can really react in a manner, who can really behave in a situation like that? And this is a behavior of the two. So there is another criticism. See, remember, Premchand also faces some criticism for creating these two kind of characters from the Dalit writers who are not very happy with him for having brought this Madhu and Gesu down to the level he did. Even in that was an act of dehumanizing certain characters in your story. So what happens finally? That they say, well, Budhya will go to heavens, and thanks to Budhya for having provided them this kind of opportunity to make merry and have that kind of a feast. And then his father, that feast where there was no limitation of food and all delicacies were served, and this spilled out. The question here, the larger question here is this, that can you legitimize that kind of a reaction? Can you legitimize that kind of a reaction? Can you really have individuals like them? Do we have people like them today, even today, in our society? Forget that society of the 1930s and 1920s and all that. The society of the 2020, we are into 2020. Can we have those characters all over again? The characters like Madhu and Gesu? This is a very disturbing question. Very disturbing question it is, to look into the dimensions of the characters, to look into that shamelessness, that indifference, splendid indifference of the two characters. In the most trying of the circumstances, they keep their cool. They are very composed individuals. So that questions that element of realism into the story. You might say that this is what realism is. He wrote what he saw, and this is what he saw. This is what he observed. But then there are the objections coming from Om Prakash Balmiki, and the objections coming from the writers have their own grounds. And what they say, they accuse Premchand of degrading Dalit characters, subaltern characters. So this is a disgrace for the subaltern characters, that he brought them down to that level of a beastly appearance. Om Prakash Balmiki particularly was very severe in his criticism of Premchand, that he completely dehumanized Dalit characters. And the very act of dehumanization was reflective, or it manifested a kind of a prejudicial representation of Dalit characters. So this element of prejudice, whether correct or not, whether has its own ground or not, but then there is a doubt about that why Premchand dehumanized them to the extent that they almost sounded like unrealistic characters. So there is a question. Dalit writers accused, like the likes of Arjun Dangle and Shanat Kumar Limbali and Madhav Desai and Bandhu Madhav and Babula Bagul, all this, they are not very happy with Premchand for having cast characters like Madhu and Gesu, who they think are the very people who have disgraced this the whole Dalit existence. They are the wretched people of the world. They have been turned into a wretched of the earth. Like Feno's work, wretched of the earth. The question here, which is very important again, is should we really agree with Dalit writers? Should we take the objection of this Om Prakash Balmiki? So Kafan obviously has some questions about it which cannot be ignored. There are some serious questions, and I do not denunciate, I do not decry that, but then I am also not very convinced about the portraiture of the two individuals who can still be very indifferent, and that kind of indifference, or that degree of indifference, I suspect is something which calls for a review, is something which calls for a reevaluation of human tendencies, and this reevaluation of human tendencies, remember, is not that is very important. That's why I said that deconstructing the deconstructed stories of Premchand, like this Kafan, has a question about it. I don't know whether the question is very convincing. There are very many people might say that, well, we do not agree with that because that's the kind of a bias of the Dalit writers against Premchand. Okay, that could be a bias. I do not negate that. I do not refute it. That their mindset, yes, maybe it was disturbed, maybe it was. But then there is another angle attached to it. Some Dalit writers believe that this Madhu and Gesu, whatever they did, was an act of insurrection. It was a revolt against the feudal structure of the time. It was a revolt against the feudal structure of the time. I don't know. It was a revolt against the feudal structure of the time. So was it that it was insurrection that did not work under the duress of a protest? They were growing in rebellion and they wanted to do nothing simply because that was to be seen in terms of a revolt by these two Dalit characters against the feudal lords. All this, so these are questions which are of course very disturbing. The criticism of the Dalit writers, their denunciation of this Kafan on some grounds, the grounds which I gave you, may not sound very convincing, but there is an element of that skepticism which does creep into the delineation of this Madhu Mangesu. Maybe we have characters like them even today. Maybe, who knows? But the problem is that stark, scorching realism. Can we really call it a scorching realism of sorts? So I think Premchand also suffers from some kind of a structural impasse. That structural impasse comes into play, and this has much to do with that deification that we have about Premchand generally. We do not question much his greatness. I do not ask you to question his greatness. What I am asking, or what I am trying to do, is to review the greatness, which is based on a variety of considerations, on a variety of issues. So let's see. That's why I have reviewed this Kafan, and my understanding of Kafan is this: that maybe this Kafan is a wonderful story. As a story, it is wonderful. But when we connect it to that realistic portraiture of characters, I think our skepticism grows there only. My own skepticism becomes very prominent. It becomes very apparent. It becomes very noticeable, because that does induce an element of discomfiture in me while I react to those two characters and say they are really people. Are they really the people who should be taken very seriously, or should be taken as representations in reality of sorts? So that's a question. That's a very important question, which just cannot be dismissed without going into the merits of it. So this is what I think. So that structural impasse I was talking about, Premchand did suffer from some kind of structural impasse, and the limitations of his vision is very much apparent here. So I don't think Premchand is very transcendental. If you read Dickens today, you will find that Dickens is more prominent today, more relevant today, more germane today. If you read John Steinbeck, you will find him that is much more relevant today than he was in his own times. So they are very transcendental people. They transcend their time. They transcend time and space and geography. Here, because every society is changing. Every society is a changing society. Your society, my society, the society of the world around. Everything changes. Nothing is fixed. Nothing is stable. And this stability is always challenged. Nothing is stable. No truth can ever be stable. So when you do not have stability in terms of truth or in truth, then I think stability itself is a very questionable thing. That is one thing. Second, which I think I would like to conclude this Kafan as a story which has many dimensions to it, which is a story which is wonderfully conceived, fabulously conceived. As a matter of conception, it is very, very good. But when you execute it and when you make them do things of the kind they did, then you certainly get disillusioned. And perhaps even if you portray me, make me a character and portray me into a situation like that, and make me work or make me react the way they did, I don't think I would be very happy about that. So that is one dimension, one aspect of it. Or else, there is Kafan is one of the greatest stories ever told on this earth. But but then there are some concussions which they leave for us to see, to look, to view, to review, and try and keep going back to them and see and establish whether we can really have some questions on that or not. I hope this Kafan will not be seen as a story which is not realistic, or something which is completely there is a complete intervention of fantasy about it. The intervention of fantasy or intervention of fantasy is there. Yes, there is an intervention of fantasy into the portraiture of the two characters, no questions about that. And if you say there is an intervention of fantasy, then Premchand would feel relief about it, that yes, it was the fantasy rather than to be a reality and the movement indeed. But then that element of rebellion is also there, that element of insurrection is also there, that element of disgrace about these dehumanized characters is also there. So a whole variety of things are there. So it's not that it's a story with a singularity of meaning. And remember that I said that there cannot be any final judgment on any story as long as you keep reading the text. So the more you read the text, you will modify your opinion, you will have to see, you will check it, you will check them, you will recheck them, and of course your interpretation and reinterpretation of things will depend on how you take them in the changing perspective of time. That's what this Kafan is. Okay, so and see, here we have another story that is called Poos ki Raat. Poos ki Raat, is also a very good story. This is a very good story, no questions about that. Because here we do not have controversies regarding it. Here we do not have issues about it, because Poos ki Raat is a story which tells you about a woman, Munni, who is the wife of Halku. There are two characters or three characters only. One is Jabra, the dog, then Munni is the wife of Halku. Halku himself is a character here who has to pay, who keeps vigilance of the crops at night in chilling winter nights, and he is trying to buy a blanket for himself. For himself, yes. He used to buy a blanket, and for that he has savings also about ₹3, which is a reserve fund for the purchase of a blanket. But then comes the man to claim that money. He owes money to him. He comes and asks for the money, and here Munni comes into play. Munni is a very strong, resolute character here. Remember, one thing I must point out, that the women of Premchand are much more assertive than the men. This is a very important observation that you must make. You must look into or examine the women characters of Premchand. Even Godan, there you also find ladies' characters are very assertive there. Women characters are very assertive. So women characters are very assertive. They are more resolute in terms of their determination to fight the odds, rather than men who are timid, who are tame, who do not have that intense voice of protest. They don't have that. But women do. Women do have that guts, that gumption, that courage, that authority, that resistance. So the resistance of women in Premchand is higher than men. This is a very particular observation that generally made about him, about stories. So Poos ki Raat, there also the important thing is this, that Halku goes to the field to keep a vigil of the crops, and that chilling winter night where he doesn't have even a blanket to cover himself, and the blanket is to be bought, but somehow that money is given to him. Even despite Munni's intervention and Munni's protest, that money, because he says it's very difficult for me to bear this burden of keeping somebody's debt, and he will be right on my head every day if I don't give the money back to him. So he pays him that ₹3, and the man goes away having taken that money. Now what happens? That his wife accuses him of having toiled day in and day out, and then that hard, intense labor does not suffice to get you 2 times meal. So Munni is very observant. She reacts on the spot. And while she reacts on the spot, in her reaction, there lies the resistance. There lies the resistance. There is a subdued undercurrent of resistance in Munni. Not very apparent, but you can see that. But here, Halku is a timid character. Halku is somebody who doesn't have the resources to fight with the condition. Yes, he goes without the blanket. So when he goes without the blanket, and of course that's a very chilling, scorching winter night, where it's a nerve-shredding night of winter. Very intense cold is there. and obviously he has no resources to combat that cold. He has no resources to fight against the cold, to protect himself from that cold. And finally, what happens that he loiters around along with Jabra. He goes here and there, finally finds some pieces of woods and sticks, and then makes a bonfire out of it and tries and warm his body from out of that only. It does happen. Meanwhile, Jabra finds a movement around, and then the dog runs away to the field and then tries and fights whatever to the best of his capacities, the onrushing and attacking animals, which, and finally the crop for which he was there, this much of endurance, this much of trouble, this much of hardship that Halku faced, was to keep a vigil of the crop, and the crop was completely, finally devastated despite his vigilance. What happens in the morning, that when his wife comes and makes him where you are, what you're doing, and then he comes somehow, what happened, say, well, everything is destroyed, the whole crop is destroyed, and Jabra was there into the final breath and all that. So what you find, that here this fellow has no regrets for the devastation of the crops. What he says, he rises up and says, well, it is good that this chapter is over. I'm not going to work any longer on the fields, or I will not going to keep any vigilance and all that for this, and no longer I would have to sleep under this open sky when in this chilling winter nights. So remember, what is important here? The message important here is that Halku never wanted to keep that vigilance, but he drove himself into it against his own will. He drove himself into it against his own will, and he says that working on field did not fill his tummy, did not suffice to get him the kind of did not suffice for 2 times meal for him, and finally he was relieved. So he is a relieved character at the end of the day, that, well, let there be devastations and we will see to it. I will switch over to some other job, I will switch over to some other business, but then again I will not have to come back to this field for the acts of vigilance during night. What Premchand does here? What is the message here in this story? What is the message here? Message here is this, that Poos ki Raat is a story which troubles your mind, which troubles your imagination, which troubles your whole being. It does not shake, it only troubles. Shaking is something different, that you are completely shaken up. It's not a hair or raising narrative of sorts. It is one of the stories which is considered good for reasons, because here you find that it is a very convincing story. There is no questions about that. Yes, the realistic part too is also okay. It portrays something which is very important in the context of the time in which it was written. So unlike Kafan, it is not that a story which is taken as a very kindly cut of Premchand. There is nothing that you can do. Munni is a more convincing portrait in resistance, in her decisive ability to discard this agriculture which helps poverty gain its ground. So what she accuses this vigilance at night not sufficient, or not. It cannot suffice to protect them from the blues of poverty. So it's better. Wisdom lies in discarding this profession and switching over to something else. This is what the final message of the story is. Poos ki Raat isn't a great story. I will not call it a great story, because there is no element of greatness in it, except that you have some kind of a struggle of a man. And that aspect of poverty, that aspect of duress, the financial duress is always there in almost every story of Premchand, given that that tussle between the feudal and the working class structure. So Premchand talked about both. There is a reference to class struggle, and there is a reference to caste struggle also. And which side of the fence does Premchand belong to is something which is very questionable, something that you can see for yourself, something that I can see for myself, and I have to judge. So my own judgment will matter rather than to make a collective judgment sort of thing. So Premchand was, of course, a great writer, no question about that. But then this deification doesn't have a legitimate ground. Kind of a worship, which I question that no. To that extent, I wouldn't agree. Yes, he was a great writer, one of the great writers of the time, because then that was the growing period of Indian literature, early period of Indian literature, because before him there was a Deputy Nazir Ahmad, Mir Ahmad Dehelvi, who wrote, and possibly after that Premchand came into light as a writer, and he wrote extensively. He wrote extensively, 300 odd stories, 12 novels and all that. So he was very prolific, no questions about that, as far as he is being prolific is concerned. But then the dimensions he probed, the dimensions of the human mind, the dimensions of the human psychology, the class, the political struggles, the social contradictions and political concussions which are there in his stories, in about every art, about his art. But then what I am trying to find today, try to discuss today, is to see that element of realism, and to see whether Premchand really transcends his time, whether he's transcendental or not, or whether we can have Premchand, the same Premchand today, as much revered in the context of the changing times. Can we really give a second thought to Premchand's evaluation of his stories? Can we have Premchand brought to a new podium of judgment? Can we have Premchand being reviewed? Can we review him in a new light, in a new context? Because the texts are always there, and that text can always be reread to try and find a new angle, a new dimension of sorts of all that. This is what my whole concern is, because nothing is stable. No interpretation can ever be stable. If somebody says that Kafan is the only greatest story written in the history, that I would never take. Why I would never take? Because they are. This is a very hyperbolic statement. If I say that Kafan is a story which is a very ordinary one, that would be an understatement, quite an understatement. That would be my bias against Premchand, a very categorical statement of bias. But then there are some questions. Remember, there are some questions in Kafan, particularly, which must be answered, which cannot be taken very lightly. And remember, when I say that you are trying to deconstruct the deconstructed stories of Premchand, obviously you are trying to find some new dimensions. You are trying to reread the text, and by rereading the text, or a close reading of the text, you may say that text is a multi-dimensional space. A text is a multi-dimensional space, to quote Ronald Barthes, and there you have the response of the individual reader becomes much more important than an established interpretation of the story. So you are more abide by the idea, generally people are more abide by the idea of what the critics have said on Premchand. It's never important what the critics have said on Premchand. What is important that how have you read that story, and the way you read that story, and based on the reading of the story, if you really arrive at a judgment, and if that judgment is rational, convincing, based fact-supported judgment, then that must be gone into, that must be taken. I hope I have tried to cover some areas of concerns. I have tried to traverse through some elements which are generally there with regard to Premchand, but at the same time, I don't say I am breaking some new grounds of interpretations. I only say that I tried to review Premchand in a reviewed context. The context of the time is something very important today, and whether we can have today a Madhu or a Gesu as convincing as it might have been in the times when they were written. But then, for me, there are many questions still which are very unanswered. I hope you have not taken it very hard. I hope you go back to the text and review them, read them, try and find something. You may not share my views completely, because maybe there is a radical rupture kind of a thing, or there is a radical departure from the traditionally held views. But then that's not very important for anyone, because as a reader of the story, or as a reader of any text, you can have your own judgments, as long as the judgments are based on some rational understanding or rational grounds and all that. So I hope Premchand is revisited, Premchand is reviewed, is reevaluated in the context. Of course, the context of the time will give you a new context of the story that Premchand wrote. I have tried to evaluate these two stories, Kafan and Poos ki Raat. Poos ki Raat is a very ordinary story, not very. Yes, here is the question, Saloni. Professor Saloni Kumar, thank you very much for your question. You are talking about the stories of Premchand. What about the loss of cultural nuances when translated into English? That's what always the challenge has. Yesterday, while I was talking on translation, this is what I said, that Premchand is lost in translation also. So translation does its own tricks. And your question that cultural nuances are always compromised, they are also broken, sometimes they completely disappear. So that depends on the skill of the translator. Much will depend on the skill of the translator and the translator is. So generally what happens, that it is not easy to retain the cultural norms and nuances and the cultural tendencies of one language into the another language. So that is always the fear, that is always the challenge that you have to negotiate. Professor Saloni Kumar, your question is taken, and I hope I have answered the question. Yes, if you have any other question, you can always post it. You can post it now also, because as long as it is live, and even after that I can get back to questions. Thank you very much, Professor Saloni Kumar, for your question. You are talking about the stories of Premchand. What about the loss of cultural nuances when translated into English? Yes, there is always the threat of losing them. There is always the threat of tampering with the cultural ethos and nuances whenever there is an act of translation is involved. It happens to Premchand, it happened to other writers, and it will happen to many more writers if they are translated, brought from one language to another. Okay, so that's it. I hope I have done no injustice to Premchand. I haven't damaged or left any bruises mark on anybody's understanding of Premchand. Otherwise, simply it's my own perspective. You can challenge it, no questions about that, no problems about that. You can challenge it. You can always challenge it. But then I have my own understanding of Premchand. And remember, this element of universality about Premchand is always under clouds. Always in the clouds. You say that that was the demand, what he wrote was the demand of the time. He wrote under the duress of the time. I will say that this is the limitation of Premchand also at the same time. Maybe he wrote a number of stories. Writing too much is not very important. Writing the times, Dickens also wrote his times. And in trying to, Dickens wrote his own conditions of life, and in writing the conditions of life, that he went on to write the conditions of the time, and there is a connectivity between the personal problems and the turbulence of the time. If you connect your personal turbulence to the turbulence of the time, that means there will be something that some substance to that story. So that's what Dalit writers, when they say that no, you can't write a Dalit story because you are not a Dalit. Why? Because the intensity of that experience will not be there. If you do not realize what fire is unless you burn your finger. Unless you burn, then only you get to know what fire is and how intense it is. What is the pain of the fire? What are the bruises of the fires and all that? So that's also one of the perceptions. That's also one of the views to be taken. So that's it for now today. Thank you very much, my viewers. I am really thankful to you that you heard me, and then you will come with your questions. You will come with your challenges also. So for me, this deification of Premchand should be checked. That's what my final word is. And since there is no finality of judgment, and there cannot be any finality of judgment on any text, so still the text is open to interpretations, the text is open to views and reviews, so you can always view it, you can always review it. Thank you very much everybody for joining me. Thank you very much.